You're listening to real, true crime stories told in the dark. No distractions, just the facts, the mystery, and the rain. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, close your eyes, relax, and let's dive into tonight's cases. The Grim Sleeper, a shadow over South Los Angeles introduction. The streets of South Los Angeles have witnessed many tragedies over the decades, but few as prolonged or as devastating as the killing spree of one man who came to be known as the Grim Sleeper. For nearly 25 years, he preyed upon vulnerable women in the community, leaving behind a trail of grief and unanswered questions. His nickname came from an apparent 14-year hiatus in his killings, a sleep in his murderous activities, though investigators would later question whether he had truly stopped at all. This is the story of one of California's most prolific serial killers, Lonnie David Franklin Jr., the investigation that spanned decades, the community he terrorized, and the lives forever altered by his actions. It's also a story about systemic failures, about whose disappearances warrant urgent attention, and about the families who never stopped searching for justice that a community under siege in the 1980s. South Los Angeles was a community struggling with the crack cocaine epidemic, economic hardship, and strained relations with law enforcement. It was against this backdrop that women began to disappear. Many were vulnerable, some involved in sex work or struggling with addiction, but all were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends whose lives mattered. The first known victim connected to the Grim Sleeper was Deborah Jackson, discovered in an alley on August 10, 1985. She had been shot 3 times in the chest and discarded like refuse. Over the next 3 years, more women would meet similar fates. Henrietta Wright, Barbara Ware, Bernita Sparks, Mary Lowe, Lacrica Jefferson, Alicia Alexander. Each woman was found in abandoned areas, alleys, dumpsters, or parks. Most have been sexually assaulted, and most have been shot with the same .25 caliber handgun. The community was terrified, but media coverage remained minimal. These weren't the kinds of cases that typically captured headlines or spurred major task forces. These were black women from impoverished neighborhoods, and their deaths did not generate the same urgency as similar crimes in more affluent areas might have. In 1988, after the discovery of Alicia Alexander's body, the killings seemed to stop. Some victims' family members continued to push for answers, but gradually, the cases grew cold. The killer had seemingly disappeared, though his shadow still loomed over the community. The sleep period for 14 years, from 1988 to 2002, it appeared the killer had gone dormant, thus earning him the moniker the Grim Sleeper years later. But was he truly inactive? Later investigations would suggest otherwise. During this supposed hiatus, life continued in South Los Angeles. The 1992 riots came and went. Community structures evolved. And hidden in plain sight among his neighbors was Lonnie Franklin Jr., working as a garbage collector for the city of Los Angeles and later as a backyard mechanic. He was married with children, attended church occasionally, and was known as a friendly, if somewhat peculiar, presence in the neighborhood. Franklin lived on 81st Street, in the very heart of the geographic area where most of the bodies had been found. He was a familiar face, someone who would wave to neighbors and engage in casual conversation. No one suspected that this ordinary-seeming man could be harboring such dark secrets. What was he doing during those 14 years? Police would later find photographs of numerous unidentified women among Franklin's possessions, raising questions about whether there were victims during this period who remained undiscovered or unconnected to him. At least one woman would later come forward with a story of being assaulted by Franklin during this sleep period, suggesting his predatory behavior never truly ceased. The killings resume in March 2002. The body of Princess Bertha Muir, a 15-year-old girl, was discovered in an alley in Inglewood. She had been strangled. This murder method differed from the earlier shootings, which initially prevented investigators from connecting her death to the earlier cases. Then in July 2003, Valerie McCorvey, 35, was found strangled and sexually assaulted. And in January 2007, the body of Janecia Peters, 25, was discovered in a trash bag inside a dumpster. She had been shot with a .25 caliber gun, similar to the weapon used in the 1980s murders. The similarities between these new killings and the older cases prompted the Los Angeles Police Department to finally establish a task force in 2007 to investigate what they began to suspect was the work of a serial killer. They collected DNA evidence from the crime scenes and found matches between several of the cases, confirming their suspicions. The community's fears were reignited. A killer who had terrorized the streets 2 decades earlier appeared to be active once more, and women in South Los Angeles again found themselves looking over their shoulders, wondering if they might be next. At a community response as the reality of a serial killer targeting their community became clear. Residents of South Los Angeles began to organize. The Black Coalition Fighting Back Serial Murders, initially formed in the 1980s when the first bodies were discovered, was revitalized. Led by community activist Margaret Prescott, they demanded more resources for the investigation and better communication from police. They questioned why these murders, primarily of black women, had not received the same attention as similar crimes in other parts of the city. They raised uncomfortable but necessary questions about racial disparities in law enforcement responses and media coverage. Their advocacy brought increased attention to the case. The Los Angeles Police Department offered a $500,000 reward for information leading to the killer's arrest, and they began using new DNA technology to try to identify him. Meanwhile, family members of the victims carried an unimaginable burden. They kept memories of their loved ones alive, spoke at community meetings, and pressed officials for answers. Mary Alexander, whose daughter Alicia was killed in 1988, became a powerful voice, refusing to let her daughter's case be forgotten. The DNA breakthrough in 2008, investigators employed a controversial but innovative technique. They collected DNA from the crime scenes and searched for partial matches in the California felon database, looking not necessarily for the killer himself, but for relatives who might share similar genetic markers. This technique, called familial DNA searching, was relatively new and had only been used successfully a handful of times worldwide. The search yielded a partial match to a man named Christopher Franklin, who had been convicted of a felony weapons charge. Christopher was too young to have committed the 1980s murders, but the genetic similarity suggested a close male relative might be the killer they sought. Investigators began looking at Christopher's father, Lonnie David Franklin Jr., to confirm their suspicions. They needed Franklin's DNA to compare with that found at the crime scenes. But they couldn't simply demand a sample without sufficient cause. In an ingenious bit of detective work that sounds like something from a crime drama, an undercover officer posed as a waiter at a restaurant where Franklin was attending a birthday party. The officer collected Franklin's pizza crust, utensils, and a glass he had used, securing the DNA sample they needed. The sample was processed, and the results were definitive. Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s DNA matched that found on several of the victims. After more than 20 years of searching, they had finally identified the grim sleeper. Arrest and discovery on July 7, 2010, police arrived at Franklin's home on 81st Street with a search warrant and an arrest warrant. The 57-year-old was taken into custody without incident, appearing surprised but not particularly distressed. What investigators found inside his house painted a disturbing picture. Hidden among Franklin's possessions were hundreds of photographs and videos of women, many in vulnerable positions, unconscious, or in various states of undress. They also discovered a .25 caliber handgun, which ballistics would later match to bullets recovered from several victims. Perhaps most chilling was the revelation that Franklin had kept trophies from his victims, small, personal items that seemed to serve as mementos of his crimes. This practice is common among serial killers, suggesting a disturbing psychological connection to the acts they've committed. The photos represented a new and troubling dimension to the case. Police would eventually release 180 images of unidentified women to the public, hoping to determine if they were additional victims or if they were alive and could provide more information about Franklin. Some women were identified and found alive, with troubling stories of encounters with Franklin. Others remained unidentified, leaving questions about whether the true extent of Franklin's crimes would ever be known. The man behind the murders, who was Lonnie Franklin Jr., born in 1952, He had served in the U.S. Army in Germany during the 1970s. Upon returning to the States, he worked various jobs, including as a garbage collector for the city of Los Angeles and later as a backyard mechanic. Neighbors described him as friendly, if somewhat eccentric. He was known for working on cars in his driveway and for having a revolving door of women visiting his house, even though he was married. Some neighbors later recalled that Franklin would often make disparaging remarks about sex workers, whom he referred to in derogatory terms. Franklin had a criminal record that included charges for theft, misdemeanor assault, and one charge of gang rape in 1982, though the latter was plea bargained down to a lesser charge. Despite these encounters with the law, he had largely managed to avoid serious consequences and had never been required to provide DNA that would have linked him to the murders earlier. What drove him to kill remains unclear. Like many serial killers, Franklin appeared to target specific types of victims. In his case, primarily African American women who were vulnerable due to involvement in sex work or struggles with addiction. He operated in an area he knew well, using his familiarity with the neighborhood to hunt victims and dispose of their bodies without detection. The apparent 14-year gap in his killing spree remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. Some criminologists have suggested that serial killers don't typically stop unless they are incarcerated, institutionalized, or dead. This has led to speculation that there might be additional victims from this period who have not been connected to Franklin, possibly because their bodies were never found or because they were killed in different jurisdictions. Justice delayed following his arrest in 2010. The legal process moved slowly. Franklin was charged initially with 10 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The attempted murder charge related to Anitra Washington, who survived an attack in 1988 that bore hallmarks of the Grim Sleeper's method. Washington would prove to be a crucial witness, as she had seen her attacker's face and could identify Franklin in court. The complexity of the case, the volume of evidence, and various legal maneuvers led to nearly 6 years passing between Franklin's arrest and the start of his trial. During this time, investigators continued to search for connections between Franklin and other unsolved murders, using DNA and ballistics evidence to build the strongest possible case. For the families of the victims, this delay was agonizing. Some have been waiting for answers since the 1980s, and now they faced additional years of legal proceedings before they could see justice for their loved ones. Some family members passed away during this period, never living to see the resolution of the case. The trial finally began in February 2016. Over the course of several months, prosecutors presented forensic evidence, including DNA and ballistic matches. They showed the jury Franklin's collection of photographs and the items he had kept from his victims. And perhaps most powerfully, they presented testimony from Anitra Washington, who looked directly at Franklin in the courtroom and identified him as the man who had shot her nearly 3 decades earlier. Verdict and aftermath on May 5th, 2016, the jury reached their verdict after deliberating for just over a day. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was guilty on all counts, 10 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The following month, the same jury recommended the death penalty, and on August 10th, 2016, the judge formally sentenced Franklin to death. The verdict and sentence brought a measure of closure to the families who had waited so long for justice. Diana Ware, stepmother of Barbara Ware, who was killed in 1987, told reporters, "I'm just glad it's over and that he'll never be out on the streets again." However, the case left many unanswered questions. How many more victims might there have been? What happened during the apparent 14-year hiatus? And perhaps most importantly, how was Franklin able to continue killing for so long without being caught? On March 28, 2020, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was found unresponsive in his cell at San Quentin State Prison. He was pronounced dead, with the cause appearing to be from natural causes, though a formal determination was pending. Franklin was 67 years old. His death meant that some questions about his crimes might never be answered. Legacy of the case, the Grim Sleeper case, left several important legacies. It highlighted the effectiveness of familial DNA searching as an investigative technique, which has since been used to solve numerous cold cases, including identifying the Golden State Killer in 2018. IT also sparked important conversations about race, class, in which victims receive attention from law enforcement and media. The fact that these murders, primarily of black women from disadvantaged backgrounds, received relatively little attention until they were linked together years later raised uncomfortable questions about societal values and priorities. The work of community activists, particularly the Black Coalition fighting back serial murders, demonstrated the power of grassroots advocacy in pushing for justice. Their persistent efforts kept pressure on law enforcement and ensured these women were not forgotten. For law enforcement, the case underscored the importance of communication between different jurisdictions and departments. Some critics argued that if police had more effectively shared information and recognized patterns earlier, Franklin might have been caught sooner, potentially saving lives. Remembering the victims and discussing the Grim Sleeper case, it's crucial to remember that at the center of this horrific story are the victims, women whose lives were cut short and whose families were left with unimaginable grief. They were not just statistics or case files, but individuals with dreams, relationships, and people who loved them. The confirmed victims included Deborah Jackson, 29 Henrietta Wright, 34 Barbara Ware, 23 Bernita Sparks, 26 Mary Lowe, 26 Lacrica Jefferson, 22 Alicia Alexander, 18 Princess Bertha Muir, 15 Valerie McCorvey, 35 Janisha Peters, 25, and there was Anitra Washington, who survived her attack and whose testimony was crucial in bringing Franklin to justice. There may be others whose connections to Franklin remain unknown or unproven. Each victim represents a life with potential, a family left with questions, and a community diminished by their loss. At conclusion, the story of the Grim Sleeper is one of tragedy and delayed justice. It's about a predator who exploited societal blind spots to continue killing for decades. It's about a community that had to advocate for itself when institutions failed to provide protection and justice. And it's about families who never gave up their search for answers. The case also raises important questions about how we value different lives in our society, about the resources dedicated to solving crimes in different communities, and about the voices we choose to amplify or ignore. The women targeted by Lonnie Franklin Jr. were often marginalized in life, and initially, their deaths did not command the attention they deserved. In remembering this case, we honor the victims by acknowledging not just how they died, but that they lived, that they were people with intrinsic value, deserving of protection, justice, and remembrance. And we recognize the resilience of a community that refused to let these women be forgotten, that demanded attention and action, and that ultimately played a crucial role in bringing a killer to justice. The shadow of the Grim Sleeper has finally lifted from the streets of South Los Angeles. But the lessons of this case, about vigilance, about advocacy, and about whose lives we value, remain as relevant as ever. The Hatton Garden Heist, the elderly gang's $20 million Easter weekend robbery. Welcome to today's episode, where we explore one of the most audacious heists in British criminal history, the Hatton Garden safe deposit burglary. What makes this crime particularly fascinating isn't just the enormous value of the stolen goods, estimated at around $20 million, but the fact that it was carried out by a crew of elderly thieves, most in their 60s and 70s. This is the story of what the British press would come to call the Dad's Army, or Diamond Weasers, career criminals who executed one final, spectacular job: the setting Hatton Garden. Even the name evokes wealth and precious stones. For over 2 centuries, this small area in London's Holborn district has been the beating heart of Britain's jewelry trade. Nestled within this glittering quarter stood the Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Ltd., a vault facility housing hundreds of safe deposit boxes containing jewelry, cash, gold, and other valuables. Many box holders were jewelers who used the facility to store their most precious items overnight and during holidays. The building itself was unremarkable. 88 to 90 Hatton Garden, a 7-story property housing various businesses, with a safe deposit company occupying the basement and ground floor. While not as technologically advanced as modern banks, the vault was still considered secure with multiple layers of protection. A front door with electronic locks, second heavily reinforced door, motion sensors, and the vault itself. A 2-meter thick reinforced concrete room containing rows of safe deposit boxes. The IT was the perfect target for those with the right skills, tools, and most importantly, patience. The planning, like most masterful heists, the Hatton Garden job wasn't spontaneous. Evidence suggests planning began at least 3 years before the actual burglary. The ringleaders, Brian Reeder, Terry Perkins, Danny Jones, and John Kenny Collins, were not newcomers to crime. Reeder, the oldest at 76 and known in criminal circles as the Master, had been involved in numerous high-profile robberies dating back to the 1960s. The crew conducted extensive reconnaissance. They observed the building's routine, studied its security systems, and identified vulnerabilities. They likely obtained inside information about the alarm system and building layout. Their most crucial discovery was that the vault's main door, while formidable, wasn't the only way in. The vault's reinforced concrete walls were penetrable with the right equipment. The timing was meticulously chosen. Easter weekend 2015. A 4-day holiday when businesses would be closed and the normal hustle and bustle of Hatton Garden would fall quiet. It was the perfect window of opportunity. What made this heist particularly remarkable was the age of its participants. The tabloids weren't exaggerating when they dubbed them the Diamond Weezers. Brian Reeder, 76, was the strategic mind, a career criminal who had been involved in infamous heists dating back decades, including the 1983 Brinksmat robbery. Despite his age, Reeder's criminal instincts remained sharp. Terry Perkins, 67, brought technical expertise to the operation. He was celebrating his birthday during the actual heist, marking his 67th year in an unusual fashion by drilling through concrete. Danny Jones, 60, was known as an eccentric but gifted thief with a particular talent for defeating alarm systems and locks. John Kenny Collins, 75, served as the lookout, monitoring the street from a nearby position in his distinctive white Mercedes. Carl Wood, 58, was brought in for additional muscle, though he would eventually lose his nerve partway through the operation. William Billy Lincoln, 60, was primarily involved in moving and storing the stolen goods after the heist. Hugh Doyle, 48, the youngest of the group, provided his workshop as a handover location for the stolen goods. And finally, there was the mysterious figure known only as Basil, later identified as Michael C., the alarm expert who could defeat sophisticated security systems with ease. Between them, they had over 200 years of criminal experience. Many had served prison time together, forming bonds that would now be put to the test in one final spectacular job. The execution. Day 1, the heist began on Thursday, April 2nd, 2015, the start of the Easter weekend. At approximately 8:20 p.m., a red Citroen van pulled up outside 88 to 90 Hatton Garden. Men carrying bags and equipment entered the building. Disguised as workmen, they went unnoticed in an area accustomed to deliveries and maintenance work. The first challenge was gaining access to the building itself. This is where Basil proved invaluable. With his expertise in alarm systems, he managed to bypass the building's security and let the team inside. Once in, they headed to the elevator shaft, which provided access to the basement where the vault was located. The crew disabled the elevator on the second floor, then climbed down the shaft to reach the basement. They entered the vault room, but immediately faced a significant obstacle: the alarm system. Despite their planning, the alarm was triggered. A security alert was sent to the monitoring company, which then contacted the Metropolitan Police. What happened next was an extraordinary stroke of luck for the thieves. The police response was classified as a Grade B alert, not requiring immediate attention. An officer drove by the building, noticed nothing unusual from outside, and left without investigating further. The heist continued uninterrupted. Inside, the team began their assault on the vault. Their method was both crude and effective, using a powerful Hilti DD 350 diamond core drill to bore holes through the 2-meter reinforced concrete wall. This was grueling work, especially for men of their age. The drill was heavy, the concrete dense, and the process slow and loud. By the end of the night, they had created several holes in the vault wall, but hadn't yet broken through completely. Exhausted and facing technical problems with their equipment, they made a critical decision to leave and return the following night. It was a risky move, but they reckoned the holiday weekend gave them the time they needed. The execution, day 2 on Friday, April 3rd, not all members of the crew returned. Carl Wood, apparently losing his nerve, abandoned the operation. Brian Reeder, the eldest, also decided not to continue. Perhaps the physical demands of the previous night had proven too much for the 76-year-old. The remaining thieves returned to find their entrance undiscovered. They resumed drilling, finally creating a hole large enough for a person to squeeze through, though not without difficulty for men of their age and build. Security footage later recovered shows one thief, likely Terry Perkins or Danny Jones, struggling to wriggle through the opening, his feet being pushed by his accomplice. Once inside the vault, they faced rows of safe deposit boxes, 996 in total. They didn't have time for all of them. Using concrete crushers, angle grinders, and crowbars, they focused on the boxes most likely to contain high-value items, ultimately forcing open 73 boxes. The contents were extraordinary: gold, platinum, diamonds, sapphires, cash, and jewelry, treasures accumulated by Hatton Garden jewelers over decades. Many items were unregistered and untraceable, perfect for disposal on the black market. They worked methodically through the night and into Saturday morning. Before leaving, they wiped down surfaces to remove fingerprints and gathered their tools. The stolen goods were loaded into bags and wheeled out on trash bins, then transferred to the waiting van. By the time they departed early Saturday morning, they had pulled off one of the largest burglaries in English legal history. The discovery of the crime remained undiscovered until Tuesday, April 7th, when workers returned after the holiday weekend. What they found was shocking. The vault ransacked, safe deposit boxes torn open, and valuables worth millions gone. The police were immediately called, and one of the largest investigations in the history of the London Metropolitan Police's flying squad began. Initial estimates put the value of the stolen goods at around £14 million, approximately $20 million, though many victims were reluctant to specify exactly what they had lost, likely because some items weren't properly declared for tax purposes or were of questionable origin themselves. The investigation, codenamed Operation Spire, quickly gathered momentum. The thieves had been careful, but not perfect. Security cameras had captured images of some of the men entering the building, though their faces were partially obscured. The white Mercedes used by lookout John Collins had been recorded on numerous traffic cameras in the area. The police also recovered extensive forensic evidence. Despite the crew's attempts to clean up, they left DNA traces on items inside the vault and the surrounding areas. Cell phone data proved crucial as well. By analyzing phone records, investigators could track the movements and communications of the suspects before, during, and after the heist. Within weeks, the flying squad had identified most of the gang members. On May 19, 2015, in a series of coordinated dawn raids across London and Kent, police arrested Reeder, Perkins, Jones, Collins, and several others. The only member who eluded capture was the mysterious Basil, the alarm expert. During the arrest, police recovered only about £4 million worth of the stolen items. Much of the loot had already been dispersed or hidden. In Jones's house, they found a copy of the book Forensics for Dummies, an ironic discovery given the trail of evidence the gang had left behind. The trial. The trial began in November 2015 at Woolwich Crown Court. The evidence against the gang was overwhelming. There was DNA, phone records, automatic license plate recognition data, placing their vehicles at the scene, and even footage of some of them celebrating at a pub after the heist. Point 4, the ringleaders, Reeder, Perkins, Jones, and Collins, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit burglary. Others, including Carl Wood and William Lincoln, maintained their innocence but were convicted by the jury. In March 2016, the judge handed down substantial sentences, considering the value of the goods stolen and the significant planning involved. Reeder received 6 years and 3 months, Perkins 7 years, Jones 7 years, and Collins 7 years. Wood was sentenced to 6 years and Lincoln to 7 years. The mysterious Basil, remained at large until March 2018, when police arrested Michael Seed, an alarm specialist and electronics expert living in Islington, just 2 miles from Hatton Garden. In March 2019, Seed was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison, bringing the last member of the gang to justice nearly 4 years after the crime. The aftermath of the Hatton Garden heist instantly became the stuff of criminal legend. It captured the public imagination not just because of the enormous value of the stolen goods, but because of the advanced age of the perpetrators. These weren't sophisticated young criminals with cutting-edge technology, but elderly men with old-school skills and remarkable determination. The crime exposed significant flaws in both physical security and police response protocols. The fact that an activated alarm during a bank holiday weekend didn't trigger an immediate and thorough investigation led to major reforms in security procedures. For the victims, the aftermath was less romantic. Many jewelers lost their life's work and family heirlooms. Some items had enormous sentimental value that far exceeded their monetary worth. Despite the recovery of some goods, most of the stolen property has never been found, leading to speculation about hidden caches that might remain undiscovered. For the thieves, their last hurrah earned them little but prison time. Terry Perkins died in prison in February 2018 at age 69, never getting to enjoy his share of the loot. Brian Reeder, released early due to poor health, lived his final years under strict monitoring. The others continue to serve their sentences, with the knowledge that most of their ill-gotten gains remain recovered by police or hidden in locations now possibly forgotten. The legacy of the Hatton Garden heist has secured its place in criminal history alongside famous cases like the Great Train Robbery and the Brinksmack gold bullion theft. It has inspired books, documentaries, and feature films, including King of Thieves starring British acting legends Michael Caine and Jim Broadbent. What continues to fascinate about this case is the contradiction at its heart. On one hand, it was a meticulously planned operation that targeted an established institution and netted an enormous haul. On the other hand, it was carried out by men who were well past retirement age, some suffering from health problems, using relatively unsophisticated tools and techniques. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect is that these men, with more than 2 centuries of criminal experience between them, still believed they could pull off one last spectacular job and escape justice. It speaks to a certain kind of criminal mindset, one that never accepts that the time for such adventures is past. In the end, the Hatton Garden heist stands as both an impressive criminal achievement and a cautionary tale. Despite their expertise and planning, despite the millions they temporarily had in their possession, the Diamond Weezers ended their careers not in luxury, but in prison cells, a final reminder that in crime, as in legitimate pursuits, time eventually catches up with everyone. Thank you for listening to the remarkable story of the Hatton Garden heist, where a crew of elderly thieves pulled off one of the most audacious robberies in modern history, only to discover that even the perfect crime leaves behind imperfect evidence. The staircase. Did Michael Peterson kill his wife? Or was it an owl? Welcome to today's episode where we dive into one of the most perplexing and controversial true crime cases of the past few decades, the death of Kathleen Peterson and the subsequent trial of her husband, novelist Michael Peterson. This case, which later became the subject of the groundbreaking documentary series The Staircase, continues to spark debate among true crime enthusiasts and legal experts alike. What truly happened that night in December 2001? Was it murder, an accident, or perhaps something even more unexpected, like an owl attack? Let's examine the evidence, the trial, and the theories that have made this case so enduringly fascinating. The night of December 9th, 2001, our story begins in Durham, North Carolina, in the affluent Forest Hills neighborhood. Michael and Kathleen Peterson lived in a sprawling 9,000 square foot mansion, a testament to their comfortable lifestyle. Michael was a novelist, known for military thrillers, and a local newspaper columnist. Kathleen was an executive at Nortel Networks, a telecommunications company. By all outward appearances, they were a successful, happy couple. On the evening of December 9th, 2001, according to Michael Peterson, the couple had been drinking wine and sitting by their pool despite the cool December air. Later, He claimed Kathleen went inside to prepare for bed while he remained outside for a while longer. When he eventually entered the house, he found his wife unconscious at the bottom of the staircase, lying in a pool of blood. At 2:40 a.m., Peterson called 911, frantically telling the dispatcher, "My wife had an accident. She's still breathing. She fell down the stairs." When first responders arrived, they found Kathleen Peterson dead, with severe lacerations to her head and a large amount of blood at the scene. The blood had begun to dry, suggesting to investigators that some time had passed between her injuries and Peterson's call for help. What initially appeared to be a tragic accident quickly transformed into something more sinister in the eyes of investigators. The amount of blood, the pattern of lacerations on Kathleen's head, and inconsistencies in Michael's story raised immediate red flags. Within a week, Peterson was charged with first-degree murder. The evidence against Michael Peterson, the prosecution's case against Michael Peterson, was built on several key elements that, they argued, pointed definitively to murder rather than an accidental fall. First, and most compelling, was the physical evidence. Kathleen Peterson had sustained 7 deep lacerations to the back of her head, injuries that medical examiner Dr. Deborah Radish testified were inconsistent with a fall downstairs. The prosecution argued that these wounds were instead consistent with being beaten with a blunt object, possibly the blow poke, a fireplace tool, that was mysteriously missing from the Peterson home. Then there was the blood evidence. Blood spatter analysis expert Dwayne Deaver testified that the blood patterns at the scene indicated a beating, not a fall. There were blood spatter marks high on the walls, cast-off patterns suggesting a weapon was swung repeatedly, and smear blood that suggested cleanup attempts. Deaver was emphatic in his testimony. This scene was staged. Perhaps most damning was the lack of skull fractures. Falls typically result in skull fractures, but Kathleen had none. Instead, she had multiple deep lacerations that didn't penetrate her skull. This, prosecutors argued, was more consistent with multiple blows from a weapon than with impacts against stairs. The state also pointed to Michael Peterson's behavior. His clothes had far more blood on them than would be expected from someone who simply found his wife and cradled her. There was a 2-hour gap between when neighbors heard a commotion and when Peterson called 911. And his 911 call itself contained statements that seemed designed to establish the accident narrative before anyone had even questioned it. Then there were the financial motives. Kathleen had a $1.4 million life insurance policy, and prosecutors suggested that the Petersons may have been living beyond their means. Michael Peterson's novels weren't selling well, while Kathleen was supporting the family with her executive salary. Finally, there was what the prosecution called evidence of character and habit. During the investigation, police discovered that Michael Peterson was bisexual and had been engaging in sexual encounters with men. They found email exchanges with a male escort and numerous images of male pornography on Peterson's computer. While his sexuality itself wasn't relevant to the murder charge, prosecutors suggested that Kathleen may have discovered this hidden side of her husband that night, leading to a confrontation that turned violent. The most explosive parallel evidence came from Germany. In 1985, while Peterson was living in Germany, a family friend named Elizabeth Ratliff was found dead at the bottom of her staircase after Peterson had been the last person to see her alive. He subsequently adopted her 2 daughters. The coincidence was striking, and the prosecution was allowed to present this information at trial, effectively suggesting Peterson had gotten away with murder once before. The defense's Case Michael Peterson's defense team, led by attorney David Rudolph, worked to counter each element of the prosecution's case with alternative explanations and by highlighting flaws in the investigation. The cornerstone of the defense was simple. Kathleen Peterson died from an accidental fall. They brought in their own experts who testified that the pattern of injuries was consistent with a fall where Kathleen may have turned as she fell, striking her head multiple times on different edges of the stairs. They questioned the blood spatter analysis, arguing that Deaver's methodology was flawed and his conclusions overreaching. The defense experts suggested that the blood patterns were actually consistent with an accident scenario. To AS for Peterson's behavior, the defense argued that the trauma of finding his wife bloody and dying would explain any inconsistencies in his statements or actions. They pointed out that Peterson immediately called his son and a neighbor before calling 911, which could account for some of the time gap. They also emphasized that Peterson cooperated fully with police in the initial investigation, allowing them complete access to his home without a warrant. Regarding the financial motive, the defense presented evidence that Michael and Kathleen were financially stable. Yes, Kathleen had a life insurance policy, but this was standard for an executive of her level, and the Petersons were not in financial distress that would motivate murder. The defense also worked to humanize Peterson and his relationship with Kathleen. Friends testified that the couple had a loving relationship, that Kathleen knew about Peterson's bisexuality, and that they had an understanding about his extramarital activities. They painted a picture of a modern, open marriage rather than one harboring secrets that could lead to violent confrontation, as for the Elizabeth Ratliff case. The defense emphasized that her death had been ruled an accident by German authorities at the time, and that re-examining a 15-year-old case based on limited preserved evidence was inappropriate and prejudicial. The owl theory, perhaps the most unusual aspect of the Peterson case, emerged after the trial was over. This was the now famous owl theory, which was never presented during the original trial, but has gained significant attention in subsequent years. The theory was first proposed by Durham attorney T. Lawrence Pollard, a neighbor of the Petersons who was not directly involved in the case. Pollard suggested that Kathleen Peterson had been attacked by a barred owl outside her home, and that this attack caused the lacerations on her head. According to this theory, a disoriented and injured Kathleen then stumbled inside and attempted to climb the stairs, only to fall in her weakened condition. While this might sound far-fetched at first, some compelling evidence supports this possibility. First, microscopic feathers were found clutched in Kathleen's hand during the autopsy, feathers that were not from any household item. Additionally, a small wooden sliver was found embedded in her scalp that experts have suggested could be from a tree branch or an owl's talon. Second, the lacerations on Kathleen's scalp were bifurcated or forked, a pattern that some experts have said is consistent with talon marks rather than blunt force trauma. Dr. Alan Van Norman, a neurosurgeon who reviewed the evidence, stated that the wounds look very much like the tracks that would be made by a bird of prey. Third, barred owls are common in North Carolina and are known to become aggressive during mating season, which coincides with the December timing of Kathleen's death. There have been documented owl attacks on humans in the area. Fourth, the blood evidence outside the house had not been thoroughly investigated, as the police had focused on the staircase as the primary crime scene. While never presented at trial, this theory has gained credibility with some experts over the years and represents a third possibility beyond the binary of accident or murder. The trial and verdict. Michael Peterson's trial began on July 1st, 2003, and lasted for 3 months, making it one of the longest trials in North Carolina history. The courtroom drama was intense, with emotional testimony, graphic crime scene photos, and heated exchanges between attorneys that on October 10th, 2003, after 5 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Michael Peterson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But this was far from the end of the story. The aftermath and appeals following his conviction, Peterson began the appeals process, maintaining his innocence throughout. His first major breakthrough came in 2011, when SBI agent Dwayne Deaver, whose blood spatter analysis had been crucial to the prosecution's case, was fired after an independent audit found that he had misrepresented evidence and overstated conclusions in multiple cases, not just Peterson's. Based on this revelation, Judge Orlando Hudson, who had presided over the original trial, granted Peterson a new trial in December 2011. Peterson was released from prison on bond while awaiting retrial as his new trial date approached. Peterson and his defense team faced a difficult decision. The prosecution was prepared to try him again, and while the blood spatter evidence was now tainted, many other elements of the original case remained intact. Peterson was also now in his 70s, and another lengthy trial and potential imprisonment would be particularly difficult at his age. In February 2017, nearly 16 years after Kathleen's death, Peterson accepted an Alford plea to the reduced charge of voluntary manslaughter. An Alford plea allows a defendant to maintain their innocence while admitting that the prosecution has enough evidence to likely secure a conviction. With credit for time served, Peterson was sentenced to time already served and was released. The documentary and public reaction to the Peterson case gained international attention through the documentary series The Staircase, directed by Jean-Xavier de Lestrade. Originally released in 2004 with 8 episodes covering the trial, the series was updated in 2013 with 2 additional episodes covering Peterson's release and appeal process, and again in 2018 with 3 more episodes covering the final resolution of the case. The documentary provided unprecedented access to Peterson, his family, and his defense team throughout the entire process. Viewers watched as trial strategies were developed, as the family coped with the stress of the trial, and as Peterson himself reacted to the twists and turns of his legal saga. The Staircase became a landmark in true crime documentary filmmaking and helped to usher in the current era of popular interest in true crime narratives. It raised important questions about the justice system, reasonable doubt, and how narratives are constructed around criminal cases. Public reaction to the documentary has been divided. Some viewers were convinced of Peterson's innocence, while others saw manipulative behavior and signs of guilt. The documentary itself has been criticized for being too sympathetic to Peterson, as the filmmakers developed a relationship with the defense team that may have colored their perspective. The case has continued to inspire analysis and debate. In 2018, Netflix acquired the documentary and released it with the additional new episodes, introducing the case to a new generation of true crime enthusiasts. That same year, a fictionalized adaptation was announced, which would later become the 2022 HBO Max limited series The Staircase, starring Colin Firth as Michael Peterson and Toni Collette as Kathleen. The competing theories now, more than 2 decades after Kathleen Peterson's death, 3 main theories persist about what happened that night. The murder theory, as presented by the prosecution, suggests that Michael Peterson beat his wife to death, possibly with the missing blow poke or similar object after a confrontation about his bisexuality or their finances. This theory is supported by the forensic evidence as presented at trial, the unusual circumstances surrounding the death, and the parallel with the Elizabeth Ratliff case. The accident theory, as maintained by Peterson and his defense team, holds that Kathleen fell down the stairs after consuming alcohol and Valium. This theory points to the lack of a definitive murder weapon, the improbability of no skull fractures and a beating death, and a lack of clear motive for Peterson to kill his wife. The owl theory suggests that an external factor, an owl attack, caused the initial injuries that led to Kathleen's fall and subsequent death. This theory attempts to explain the unusual lacerations, the microscopic feathers, and the wooden sliver found during the autopsy. Each theory has its strengths and weaknesses, and each has its adherents. The truth may lie somewhere among these explanations, or perhaps in some combination of factors that we haven't fully understood. The lingering questions, what makes the Peterson case so enduringly fascinating is not just the unusual circumstances of Kathleen's death or the dramatic twists of the legal proceedings, but the fundamental questions it raises about truth, justice, and perception. How reliable is forensic evidence, particularly when experts can come to dramatically different conclusions from the same data? The case hinged largely on the interpretation of blood spatter patterns. Is this science or art? How much should a person's character or past factor into a murder investigation? Was the inclusion of Peterson's sexuality in the Ratliff case prejudicial or legitimate evidence of pattern? How do we reconcile competing narratives when physical evidence can be interpreted in multiple ways? Is it possible that all 3 theories, murder, accident, and owl attack, contain elements of truth? And perhaps most fundamentally, what constitutes reasonable doubt, and how certain must we be before we imprison someone for life? The Peterson case offers no easy answers. Michael Peterson, now in his late 70s, maintains his innocence while legally being considered guilty of voluntary manslaughter. The families of both Kathleen Peterson and Elizabeth Ratliff continue to seek closure for deaths that occurred decades ago. And the public continues to debate what really happened on that staircase in the absence of definitive evidence or a confession. The death of Kathleen Peterson remains what it has always been, a mystery wrapped in circumstances both ordinary and extraordinary, a case that reminds us how elusive truth can be, even when we believe we're seeing it with our own eyes. What really happened that night? Was it murder, an accident, or perhaps even an owl? The staircase keeps its secrets, and we may never know for certain. Thank you for listening to this exploration of one of true crime's most enduring mysteries. Whatever theory you find most plausible, the case of Michael Peterson and the death of Kathleen Peterson serves as a reminder of the complexity of human relationships, the limitations of forensic science, and the sometimes unsatisfying nature of justice. The Dyatlov Pass incident, Death on Dead Mountain introduction. The wind howls across the snow-covered slopes of the northern Ural Mountains. It's February 1959, and somewhere in this desolate, frozen landscape, 9 experienced hikers have vanished into the night. What was supposed to be a challenging but manageable winter expedition has somehow gone terribly wrong. In the coming weeks, search parties will discover a scene so bizarre and disturbing that it will spawn decades of theories, investigations, and speculation. This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass incident, one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. A tale of 9 lives cut short in circumstances so strange that over 60 years later, we're still trying to understand what happened on that cold February night. What could cause 9 skilled outdoor enthusiasts to flee their tent in a panic, underdressed in sub-zero temperatures, apparently choosing certain death in the snow over whatever threat they perceived inside or around their camp? Tonight, we'll walk through the known facts, examine the evidence, and explore the theories that attempt to explain this chilling mystery. This is a story about the fine line between adventure and disaster, about the unforgiving power of nature, and about the human need to find meaning in tragedy. The expedition begins. Our story starts in the industrial city of Sverdlovsk, now known as Ekaterinburg, in the heart of the Soviet Union's Ural region. It's late January 1959, and a group of 10 young men and women, most of them students or graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute, are preparing for an ambitious skiing expedition into the northern Ural Mountains. The leader of this expedition is 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, an experienced mountaineer and ski touring enthusiast known for his meticulous planning and level-headed nature. The group's goal is to reach Mount Otorten, a challenging Grade 3 hike that would help most of them earn their Grade 3 hiking certification, an impressive achievement in the Soviet outdoor classification system. The team consists of Igor Dyatlov, the 23-year-old Lida Yuri Doroshenko, 24 Ludmila Dubinina, 20 Yuri Krivonishenko, 23 Alexander Kolevatov, 24 Zinata Kolmogorova, 22 Rustam Slobodin, 23 Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, 23 Semyon Zolotaryov, 38 Yuri Yudin, 21. They're all experienced hikers with winter expedition knowledge. Zolotaryov, the oldest at 38, is a skiing and mountaineering instructor who joined the group shortly before departure. This is a team well prepared for the challenges ahead, or so they believed that on January 25th, 1959, they board a train in Sverdlovsk, embarking on a journey that will take them to Ivdol, then Vizhay, the last inhabited settlement before the wilderness. It's here that one member of the group, Yuri Yudin, makes a decision that will save his life. Suffering from rheumatism and feeling unwell, he decides to return home, reducing the expedition to 9 members. As Yudin later said, "I was the only one who did not die. The remaining 9 continue, taking a truck to the edge of the wilderness before setting off on skis on January 27th. Their destination is Mount Otorten, whose name in the local Monsey language ominously translates to "don't go there." Ahead lies approximately 50 miles of challenging terrain through the snow-covered taiga and mountains. The group's spirits are high as they begin their trek. Photos recovered from their cameras show smiling faces, playful snowball fights, and the camaraderie of young adventurers embarking on an exciting journey. They keep a detailed diary and take numerous photographs, documenting their progress. These records would later provide crucial insights into their final days. The last campsite for several days, the group makes steady progress through the snowy landscape, averaging about 6 miles per day. The weather is challenging but manageable, with temperatures around -15 to -20 degrees Celsius, 5 to -4 degrees Fahrenheit. This is cold, but not exceptional for experienced winter hikers with proper equipment. On January 31st, they reach the edge of the highland area and prepare for the climb. They stash food and equipment in a forest shelter, a common practice to lighten their loads for the ascent and to have supplies for the return journey. On February 1st, they begin crossing the pass toward Cycle Mountain, which ironically translates to Dead Mountain in the local Mansi language. Their plan is to cross the pass, camp for the night on the other side, then continue to Mount O'Torton the next day. But the weather deteriorates, bringing heavy snowfall and strong winds that reduce visibility. They lose their bearings in the wide-out conditions and unintentionally veer west toward the slope of Cycle. Realizing their mistake, but with daylight fading, Dyatlov makes a fateful decision. Rather than descending to the forest line where there would be more protection from the elements, the group sets up camp on the exposed slope approximately 1,000 meters, 3,300 feet above sea level. Later investigations would question this decision, as it seemed to go against good mountaineering practice. However, while not ideal, the location wasn't inherently dangerous for experienced winter campers. The group pitches their tent, prepares a meal, and settles in for the night. From the recovered diary entries and camera film, we know they were in good spirits despite the navigation error and challenging weather. They even crafted a small newspaper called the Evening O'Torton, filled with humorous articles and drawings. And one knows exactly what time disaster struck. But something happened that night. Something terrifying enough to make 9 experienced hikers cut their way out of their tent from the inside and flee into the sub-zero night without proper clothing, choosing certain death in the elements over whatever threat they perceived. The search when the group fails to send a telegram to their sports club upon their return as planned, there is initially little concern. Delays are common in such expeditions, particularly in winter conditions. But as days pass without word, families and friends grow increasingly worried that on February 20th, nearly 3 weeks after their estimated return date, a search and rescue operation is finally launched. The first search parties consist of volunteer students and teachers from the Hikers University, but they are soon joined by military personnel, local police, and experienced search and rescue teams. That on February 26th, searchers discover the group's abandoned tent on the slope of Cycle. What they find is perplexing. The tent is badly damaged, but not from external forces. It appears to have been cut open from the inside. All the group's belongings, including shoes, coats, and survival gear, remain inside, neatly arranged. There are 9 sets of footprints leading away from the tent, some barefoot, some in socks, some in a single shoe. The footprints indicate that the group members left the tent voluntarily, not under duress, walking at a normal pace, not running. Even more strangely, the footprints show that the group split up, with some veering toward a nearby forest approximately 1.5 kilometers, 0.9 miles, downhill. The searchers follow these tracks through the snow to the edge of the forest. Under a large cedar tree, they find the first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonichenko. They are shoeless and dressed only in underwear and shirts. The branches of the cedar are broken up to 5 meters high, suggesting someone had climbed it, perhaps to look for something or signal for help. Nearby, the remains of a small fire can be seen. Between the cedar tree and the tent, 3 more bodies are discovered, those of Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin. They are found separately at different distances from the tree, in poses suggesting they were attempting to return to the tent before succumbing to the cold. The remaining 4 hikers, Dubinina, Kolevatov, Thibaut Brignol, and Zolotaryov, are not found until 2 months later, on May 4th, after the spring thaw melts some of the snow. They are discovered in a ravine about 75 meters, 246 feet, from the cedar tree, buried under 4 meters, 13 feet, of snow. The inexplicable evidence as investigators begin to piece together the evidence. The mystery only deepens. The medical examinations reveal a puzzling array of injuries that defy simple explanation. The first 5 bodies found, Dyatlov, Doroshenko, Krivonishchenko, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin appear to have died from hypothermia. This is consistent with their lack of proper clothing in the frigid temperatures. However, Slobodin also has a fractured skull. Though this is not determined to be the cause of death, that it's the condition of the last four bodies that presents the most disturbing questions. Dubinina is missing her tongue, eyes, and part of her facial tissue. Zolotaryov and Thibault-Brignol have major chest fractures that doctors compare to injuries sustained in high-speed car crashes. Dubinina and Kolevatov also have chest fractures. Yet strangely, there is no external trauma, no bruising or soft tissue damage that would typically accompany such severe internal injuries. Adding to the mystery, traces of radiation are detected on some of the clothing, though this finding is inconclusive and disputed in later analyses. The positioning and condition of the body suggest several baffling scenarios. The four hikers in the ravine appear to have been better dressed than the others, wearing some items of clothing salvaged from their dead companions. This indicates they survived for some time after the initial incident. The cedar tree group appears to have died first, with the others perhaps attempting to care for them before retreating to the ravine. The Soviet investigation concludes with the frustratingly vague finding that the hikers died due to a compelling natural force. The case is then classified and closed, fueling decades of speculation that a legacy of theories in the years and decades following the incident. Dozens of theories have emerged to explain what happened on that February night. These range from the plausible to the fantastical. The avalanche theory suggests that the hikers cut their way out of the tent after hearing or feeling signs of an impending avalanche. They flee to what they believe is safety, but become separated in the darkness and harsh conditions. Those who reach the forest attempt to build a fire, but succumb to the cold. Others, attempting to return to the tent for supplies, collapse in the snow. The four who retreat to the ravine survive longer, but are ultimately caught in a delayed avalanche that causes their traumatic injuries. Critics of this theory point out that the slope was not steep enough for a typical avalanche. No obvious avalanche debris was found, and the hikers' footprints remained visible weeks later, which would be unlikely if an avalanche had occurred. That a variation on this is the slab avalanche theory, proposed in a 2021 study. This suggests a smaller, more localized snow slab collapse, triggered by the hikers cutting into the slope to place their tent, could have caused panic and injuries without leaving typical avalanche signs. The paradoxical undressing theory addresses one of the most perplexing aspects of the case: why the hikers were inadequately dressed. In the final stages of hypothermia, victims sometimes experience a paradoxical sensation of burning heat, causing them to remove clothing. This is a documented phenomenon, but doesn't explain why they cut the tent from inside or fled in the first place. The katabatic wind theory suggests that a sudden, powerful downdraft of cold, dense air, known as a katabatic wind, could have created a frightening noise and threatened to collapse their tent, driving them to flee. Combined with other factors like hypothermia and disorientation, this could explain the sequence of events. Then there are the more extraordinary theories. Soviet military tests gone wrong, secret weapons causing trauma and radiation, encounters with escaped Gulag prisoners, conflicts with indigenous Mansi people, or even a Yeti attack. Some point to strange orange spheres reported in the sky around that time, suggesting UFO involvement. The Russian government's secrecy about the case, classifying documents and refusing to reopen investigations for decades, only fueled conspiracy theories. When the case was finally reopened in 2019, Russian authorities concluded that an avalanche was the most likely cause, though this explanation still leaves many questions unanswered. The enduring mystery: why does the Dyatlov Pass incident continue to captivate us over 60 years later? Perhaps it's the combination of concrete evidence and inexplicable gaps that allows our imaginations to run wild. Perhaps it's the haunting final photographs recovered from the hikers' cameras. Images of young, smiling faces unaware of their impending fate. Or perhaps it's because the incident touches on something primal: the vulnerability we all feel in the face of wilderness and the unknown. 9 experienced adventurers, well-prepared and knowledgeable, still met a tragic end in circumstances bizarre enough to defy easy explanation. The pass where they died now bears the name of the group's leader, Dyatlov Pass, a somber memorial to the events of 1959. Relatives and interested researchers still make pilgrimages to the site, seeking closure or insights that remain elusive. In 2020, Russian authorities made another attempt to close the case, officially attributing the deaths to an avalanche combined with poor visibility that prevented the hikers from finding their way back to the tent. Yet many researchers and family members remain unsatisfied with this explanation, pointing to inconsistencies and unanswered questions. What we know for certain is that on that February night in 1959, something happened that was terrifying enough to drive 9 rational, experienced people to abandon their shelter and equipment, choosing certain death in the freezing darkness over whatever threat they perceived inside or around their camp. As we consider their final hours, a few things seem clear. The group faced their crisis with remarkable solidarity. There's no evidence anyone was abandoned or that the group fragmented in panic. Those who reached the forest attempted to build a fire, showing problem solving even in extreme circumstances. Those who died on the slope appear to have been trying to return to the tent to help the others. Even in their final moments, they demonstrated the teamwork and resilience that had made them successful adventurers. The conclusion, the story of the Dyatlov Pass incident is ultimately a human tragedy. The loss of 9 bright, adventurous lives in circumstances we may never fully understand. Igor Dyatlov, Yuri Doroshenko, Ludmila Dubinina, Yuri Krivonichenko, Alexander Kolevatov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Rustam Slobodin, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Semyon Zolotaryov embarked on their journey with dreams and ambitions that were cut short by forces still debated today. While theories abound, perhaps the true legacy of the Dyatlov group lies not in how they died, but in how they lived, with courage, camaraderie, and a spirit of adventure. Their story reminds us of both the wonder and the danger of the natural world, and the thin line that sometimes separates triumph from tragedy in the wilderness. As for what really happened on that snow-covered slope, we may never know with absolute certainty. Some mysteries resist neat conclusions, leaving us to contemplate the possibilities. What would cause you to cut your way out of your tent in sub-zero temperatures? What force could create injuries like those found on the hikers? Why were some clothing items found to be radioactive? The Dyatlov Pass has kept its secrets for over 6 decades. And while science continues to offer potential explanations, something about this mystery continues to haunt us. Perhaps because it reminds us that even in our modern world of technology and certainty, there remain dark corners where the unexplained still dwells, where 9 experienced hikers can vanish into the snow, leaving behind only footprints and questions that echo through the years. Their tent, cut from the inside, remains the perfect metaphor for this enduring mystery, a thin barrier between known and unknown, certainty and doubt, the rational and the inexplicable. And like those who continue to study this case decades later, we're still trying to see what was on the other side. D.B. Cooper. The perfect crime introduction. It was Thanksgiving Eve, 1971. A nondescript man in a business suit boarded Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 from Portland to Seattle. Within hours, he would pull off one of the most daring and mysterious crimes in American history and vanish into the annals of legend. He hijacked the Boeing 727, demanded and received $200,000 in ransom money, and then parachuted from the aircraft into the dark, stormy night over the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. He was never found, never identified, and never caught. This is the story of D.B. Cooper, a name that wasn't even his own, but one mistakenly reported by the press and forever etched into the American consciousness. His brazen skyjacking remains the only unsolved air piracy case in U.S. aviation history. A perfect crime that has baffled the FBI for over 5 decades and spawned countless theories, suspects, and obsessive amateur sleuths. As we navigate the twists and turns of this remarkable case, we'll examine the known facts, explore the numerous theories, and try to understand why this particular crime has so captivated our collective imagination. Was D.B. Cooper a skilled criminal mastermind who planned the perfect heist? A desperate man making one last, reckless gamble? Or perhaps something else entirely? And what happened after he leapt from that plane into the darkness and the driving rain? Did he survive to enjoy his ill-gotten gains? Or did his daring escape end in tragedy, his body and the money forever lost in the wilderness? Join us as we retrace the steps of the 20th century's most enigmatic outlaw and dive into one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. The day of the hijacking, November 24, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving. The Portland International Airport was busy with holiday travelers. At approximately 2:50 p.m., a man approached the Northwest Orient Airlines counter and purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle. He gave his name as Dan Cooper, not D.B. Cooper, as he would later be misidentified by the press. The man who would become known as D.B. Cooper was described by witnesses as being in his mid-40s, about 5 feet 10 inches to 6 foot tall, weighing around 170 to 180 pounds. He had dark hair and was wearing a black or dark brown business suit with a white shirt, narrow black tie, and a mother-of-pearl tie pin. He carried a black attaché case and appeared to be a typical businessman of the era. Nothing about his appearance raised any suspicions. Flight 305, a Boeing 727-100, was scheduled for a short 30-minute hop from Portland to Seattle. It was a routine flight on a busy travel day. The aircraft was only about one-third full, with 36 passengers and a crew of 6. Cooper took seat 18C in the last row of the cabin. Shortly after takeoff, at approximately 3 p.m., Cooper handed a note to Florence Schaffner, one of the flight attendants. Accustomed to receiving phone numbers or dinner invitations from male passengers, Schaffner initially placed the note unopened in her purse. Cooper leaned toward her and whispered, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." The note, which has never been recovered, reportedly contained a message stating that Cooper had a bomb in his briefcase. When Schaffner asked to see it, he opened his attaché case just enough to reveal what appeared to be wires and red cylindrical objects. He then calmly detailed his demands: $200,000 in negotiable American currency, equivalent to about $1.3 million today, for parachutes, 2 primary and 2 reserve, and a fuel truck standing by in Seattle to refuel the aircraft upon landing. Cooper instructed Schaffner to sit beside him, where he outlined specific details for the delivery of his demands. The aircraft was to remain on the ground in Seattle with landing gear down, and the cabin would stay unpressurized after takeoff. The money was to be delivered in a knapsack. Cooper was remarkably specific and knowledgeable in his instructions, suggesting to investigators later that he had either military or aviation experience. Schaffner conveyed Cooper's demands to the captain, William Scott, who informed Seattle Tacoma Airport Air Traffic Control. Northwest Orient's president, Donald Nyrop, authorized payment of the ransom, and the FBI began assembling the money and parachutes. Meanwhile, the flight crew informed the passengers that there would be a minor mechanical difficulty causing a delay in their arrival in Seattle. Most passengers were unaware of the drama unfolding. Cooper remained calm and even ordered a bourbon and soda, for which he paid, tipping the flight attendant. This small gesture would later add to the folkloric dimension of his character, a gentleman criminal who paid for his drink while committing a major felony. The aircraft circled Puget Sound for about 2 hours while authorities on the ground scrambled to meet Cooper's demands. During this time, Cooper appeared relaxed and in control. He was polite to the flight attendants, and there was no panic or aggression in his demeanor, just a cool, calculated determination. The exchange at approximately 5:45 p.m., Flight 305 landed at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. Cooper instructed that the aircraft be taxied to a remote, well-lit area of the tarmac, and that the window shades be drawn. He demanded that only one person approach the aircraft with the money and parachutes. The FBI worked frantically to gather the ransom money. They assembled $200,000 in $20 bills, primarily from the Seattle First National Bank. In what would prove to be a crucial decision, The FBI microfilmed all 10,000 bills before delivering them, recording the serial numbers of each. Unbeknownst to Cooper, most of the bills were from a 1969 series with serial numbers beginning with the letter L, a detail that would become significant in later years. The authorities also faced an unexpected challenge in obtaining the parachutes. Cooper had specified 2 primary, front-mounted reserve, and 2 backup parachutes. While military-grade chutes were initially considered, the FBI ultimately sourced civilian parachutes, including a training chute that was sewn shut, a fact not communicated to Cooper when they were delivered at around 5:39 p.m. Northwest employee Ali brought the money and parachutes to the aircraft. Cooper allowed the passengers, the flight attendant Schaffner, and the senior flight attendant Alice Hancock, to leave the plane. He kept aboard the pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and flight attendant Tina Mucklow. While on the ground in Seattle, Cooper outlined his flight plan to the remaining crew. He wanted the aircraft to fly to Mexico City, with a refueling stop in Reno, Nevada. He specified that the plane should fly at a maximum altitude of 10,000 feet, with landing gear down and takeoff position, wing flaps at 15 degrees, and the cabin unpressurized. These highly specific demands further suggested that Cooper had significant knowledge of aircraft operations. The FBI codenamed the case Norjack for Northwest hijacking and launched what would become one of the most extensive and expensive investigations in the Bureau's history. The initial search focused on the suspected drop zone, a vast, rugged area of forest, mountains, and rivers along the Washington-Oregon border. Within days of the hijacking, hundreds of military and law enforcement personnel were combing the area around Ariel, Washington. Army helicopters equipped with infrared scanners searched for any heat signature that might indicate a human presence. Ground teams navigated the difficult terrain, looking for any sign of Cooper or the parachutes. The search continued through the winter and into the spring of 1972, but yielded nothing conclusive. The FBI developed a profile of the hijacker based on witness accounts and his apparent knowledge of aircraft and parachuting. They believed Cooper might have had military experience, particularly as a paratrooper. His familiarity with the Seattle area suggested he might be a local. The fact that he chose a Boeing 727, one of the few commercial aircraft for which a rear exit was possible during flight, indicated careful planning and specific knowledge. Agents interviewed thousands of people named D.B. Cooper or Dan Cooper nationwide, but none matched the hijacker's description or could be linked to the crime. The FBI released composite sketches based on description from the flight crew, showing a middle-aged man with dark hair and an unremarkable, business-like appearance. Over the years, the FBI investigated more than 800 suspects. One early focus was on a Portland man named D.B. Cooper, who quickly proved to have no connection to the case. However, a reporter's confusion between this individual and the Dan Cooper who purchased the ticket led to the hijacker being permanently mislabeled as D.B. Cooper in the press and public consciousness. The Bureau also considered the possibility that Cooper was an experienced skydiver. They investigated Richard McCoy, who conducted a similar hijacking and parachute escape 4 months after Cooper, but ultimately ruled him out based on physical differences and the fact that McCoy was at home in Utah on Thanksgiving. Another significant suspect was Dwayne Weber, who allegedly confessed to being D.B. Cooper on his deathbed in 1995. Weber's widow reported that he had extensive knowledge of the hijacking and had once taken her to Ariel, Washington, commenting, "This is where it happened." However, DNA evidence later eliminated Weber as a suspect. In 2011, the FBI investigated Lynn Doyle Cooper, whose niece came forward claiming her uncle had appeared injured the day after the hijacking and had said, "We hijacked an airplane." While the FBI considered this lead credible enough to collect a DNA sample, they could not establish any definitive link. Physical evidence for nearly a decade after the hijacking, no physical evidence of Cooper or the money was discovered. Then, in February 1980, 8-year-old Brian Ingram was on vacation with his family at Tennabar, a sandbar along the Columbia River about 20 miles southwest of Ariel. While digging a fire pit on the beach, Ingram uncovered 3 packets of the ransom money, 294 deteriorated $20 bills, totaling $5,880. The serial numbers matched those recorded by the FBI in 1971. This discovery was both enlightening and perplexing. It confirmed that Cooper had successfully jumped from the aircraft with the money. However, the location of the find raised new questions. The bills were found about 20 miles from Cooper's suspected drop zone, along a stretch of river that had been thoroughly searched in the months following the hijacking. More puzzling still was the condition and arrangement of the money. The bills were severely decomposed, but still bundled in the original rubber bands, which typically deteriorate within a year in outdoor conditions. This suggested the money had not been in the water or exposed to the elements for the full 9 years since the hijacking. Various theories emerged to explain how the money ended up at Tennebar. Some suggested that Cooper might have landed in the Columbia River and drowned, with only part of the ransom washing ashore years later. Others proposed that the money had been buried elsewhere and was later uncovered by flooding or human activity, eventually making its way to the sandbar. The FBI conducted an extensive analysis of the recovered bills and the soil where they were found. Diatoms, microscopic organisms, discovered on the bills suggested they had been in water, but not necessarily for the entire period since 1971. Some experts theorized that the money had been buried in a dry location and was later exposed to water, perhaps during dredging operations in the river in 1974. Despite this tantalizing clue, no other portions of the ransom money have ever been recovered. The remaining $194,000 seemingly vanished along with Cooper himself. Banks and financial institutions remained on alert for the recorded serial numbers, but none of the bills ever surfaced in circulation. Theories and speculation in the D.B. Cooper case has spawned countless theories over the decades, ranging from the plausible to the fantastic. These generally fall into 3 categories. Cooper survived and escaped with the money. Cooper survived the jump but lost the money, or Cooper did not survive the jump. Those who believe Cooper survived point to several factors. The hijacker displayed a cool professionalism throughout the incident, suggesting meticulous planning. His knowledge of aircraft and parachuting indicated he had the skills necessary to attempt such a jump. And the fact that no body was ever found, despite extensive searching, suggests he might have successfully navigated to a prearranged extraction point. Proponents of this theory often suggest Cooper had an accomplice waiting with a vehicle, allowing him to quickly leave the area before the search began. Some believe he may have carefully selected the drop zone, possibly having stashed appropriate cold weather gear and supplies nearby in advance. Skeptics counter that surviving such a jump would have been nearly impossible given the conditions. Cooper jumped at night, in a rainstorm, wearing inappropriate clothing into a heavily wooded area with no clear landing zone. The temperature at jump altitude was well below freezing, and he would have faced winds of up to 200 miles per hour upon exiting the aircraft. Even experienced military paratroopers considered such a jump extremely hazardous. Further complicating matters, Cooper may have jumped with a non-functional training parachute rather than a viable one, as both were packed in similar bags. If so, his fate would have been sealed the moment he pulled the ripcord. Another theory suggests Cooper survived the jump but lost the money either during the descent or upon landing. This would explain why no significant portion of the ransom has ever been recovered except for the Tennebar find. Some speculate that Cooper may have died later from injuries sustained during the landing, with his remains yet to be discovered in the vast wilderness. The most straightforward explanation remains that Cooper did not survive the jump. The FBI's former lead investigator on the case, Ralph Himmelsbach, maintained this view, believing that Cooper's body lies somewhere in the rugged terrain of the Pacific Northwest, undiscovered after all these years. Cooper's legacy. On July 8, 2016, the FBI officially suspended active investigation of the Cooper case, citing the need to allocate resources to more pressing cases. Special Agent Curtis Ung stated, "Although our investigation remains unsolved, we have successfully worked this case with the expertise and assurance afforded by many advancements in forensic science. We have Jerry to thank for our confidence that we have the evidence should the case be solved." The Jerry referenced was Special Agent W.J. Jerry Thomas, who collected cigarette butts, Cooper's tie, and other evidence on the aircraft, and preserve them using protocols that would later prove vital for DNA analysis. The case, however, remains open in the public imagination. D.B. Cooper has transcended the status of mere criminal to become a folk hero and cultural icon. He's been portrayed in films, television series, songs, and books. The hijacking has inspired copycats, spawned an annual festival in Ariel, Washington, and generated a subculture of amateur sleuths who continue to pursue the case. What explains this enduring fascination? Perhaps it's the audacity of the crime. A lone man who outfoxed the authorities and disappeared with the equivalent of over $1 million of today's dollars. Or maybe it's the mystery itself, the tantalizing possibility that somewhere out there, Cooper might have been living a quiet life, perhaps as someone's unassuming neighbor or relative, harboring the secret of his daring escapade. The Cooper hijacking occurred at a unique moment in American history. The early 1970s marked the twilight of an era when air travel still retained some of its romance and exclusivity. Security was minimal, no metal detectors, no ID checks, no rigorous screening. Cooper exploited these vulnerabilities, prompting significant changes in aviation security that remain with us today. The crime also resonated with a certain anti-establishment sentiment of the times. Coming at the height of the Vietnam War and amid growing disillusionment with government authority, Cooper's exploit struck some as a victimless crime, an individual thumbing his nose at the system. No one was physically harmed, the airline's insurance covered the ransom, and Cooper displayed a certain politeness throughout the ordeal, even paying for his drink that, of course. This romanticized view overlooks the very real trauma experienced by the flight crew and the resources expended in the search. The crime was serious, and had Cooper's bomb been real rather than a bluff, the outcome could have been tragic. The conclusion half a century after a nondescript man in a business suit stepped onto a Boeing 727 in Portland. The mystery of D.B. Cooper continues to intrigue and perplex. Did he perish in the frigid wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, a victim of his own audacity? Or did he succeed in executing the perfect crime, vanishing with his ransom to live out his days in anonymous freedom? The Cooper case remains the only unsolved air piracy in U.S. aviation history. Despite one of the most extensive manhunts ever conducted, despite decades of investigation, despite advances in forensic science and DNA technology, the true identity of D.B. Cooper and his ultimate fate remain unknown. Perhaps that's fitting. In an age of surveillance cameras, electronic transactions, and digital footprints, the idea that someone could simply vanish, falling from the sky in a legend, holds a mysterious appeal. D.B. Cooper represents a particular kind of American outlaw archetype, bold, clever, and elusive. The money found at Tenna Bar stands as the only confirmed physical evidence of Cooper's journey after he stepped off the air stairs of Flight 305 and into the stormy night. Those weathered $20 bills, like the case itself, offer tantalizing clues but no definitive answers. As time passes, the likelihood of solving the mystery diminishes. Witnesses age and memories fade. Potential evidence deteriorates. If Cooper survived, he would now be in his late 90s, if still alive at all. But the legend endures. Somewhere in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, there may still lie the answer to what happened after D.B. Cooper took that fateful leap. A parachute, the remains of a briefcase, or perhaps the rest of the ransom money, waiting to be discovered by some future hiker or hunter. Until then, the case remains what it has always been, the perfect unsolved mystery, a ghost story for the modern age, and a reminder that sometimes reality can be stranger than fiction.